Welcome to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, here again with an edition of Further Upstream. I'm joined by Wayne Stender, my producer and product manager. We're going to be talking a little bit more about my conversation with Kasey Leander, another of my colleagues, about modern popcorn movies, summer flicks, the kind of things we go to see, and we typically turn our brains off. And the discussion was really about why we shouldn't do that, what the draw is all about, and the latent influence or the residual influence of Christianity and the contours of the Christian story on modern movies and stories and what that tells us. So, Wayne, welcome back. I'm glad to have you here. And this is going to be actually the last time that you join me for this show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about, before we dive into the conversation with Kasey, about why that is and what's next for you?
Yeah, so one of the hardest decisions that I'll ever have to make, but my role at the Colson Center is incredible, and I get to do amazing things and work with like brilliant people like yourself. And it's been just a huge blessing. And my role as a dad, is one that also operates in the background. And I talk a lot about that here. It's a pretty intense role, partly because of the number of people that we're chasing and trying to raise in the four walls of my house. But I have an opportunity that came up, and it's an opportunity that is really transformative for my family. And it's really actually just down the block from where I currently live. It's on the way to my kids' school. It's just an opportunity that for us at this stage of our life, that we're just kind of looking at it and saying, this is what the Lord's calling us to. He's given us 8 kids on purpose. None of them were accidents. They might have been maybe planned differently than we maybe would have planned, but we're at this stage of our life. And for this stage and this season and this moment in history, we're really feeling called to really our community, our church, and also my family. So this opportunity came up, and it's one that transforms a lot of that for us. So sadly, it's like the saddest thing that I'm doing right now, and it is horrible. But at the same time, I get the excitement of having the grace and the privilege and the opportunity to really get a chance to be with my family and choose family in a unique way. So that is hard for what I was doing with the Colson Center, but also celebrates, I think, my wife and my family in a powerful way. So that's the hard thing that I'll be doing. I'll be transitioning out of my role here with Upstream and presenting you with probably maybe a stronger, better voice in many ways. But I think that you're going to have I'm going to continue to just enjoy the conversations that you have, and probably continue to have questions that I'll email you, or maybe I'll say, Shane, can I just ask this question of you? Can I call you up? So you will not lose me as the friend that comes in and annoys you all the time. So sorry.
We could do like a phone-in session or something like that, and have Wayne come back. Well, I'm so excited about this next chapter for your life, and I know as a father of half as many children as you have, brother, that this whole fatherhood thing, this whole parenthood thing changes your priorities and your outlook on life in such radical ways that it's difficult to express it to someone who is not in the same boat. So if you told what you just said to me before I had kids 10 years ago, I would have said, I find that kind of puzzling, because I had all this jargon and all this contemplation about calling and going out into the world and like following some really explicit and well mapped out design for your life in my head. And now, I have kids, and I realize, okay, this is life here. And a lot of what else you do is, it's support for that in some really key ways. And, I'm still learning as a young father, but I can see exactly how my thinking has changed on that. And it's good to see that, celebrated and the way that you've explicitly made that the case. So I applaud your candor about that and your decision. And I'm so thankful for the time that we've been able to spend on the show talking about all these great topics. And you've got some questions here about the most recent conversation. So fire away and let's talk a little bit more about movies.
Yeah, and I wish I was more up to snuff, maybe a little bit on all of the movies that you guys talk about and know, and the backgrounds and the storylines. I have a hard time keeping track of things. Or when I watch a movie, I'm that guy that's like, man, this is really nice. It's a nice movie. It's what I guess I like it. Or I'll fall asleep in the movie and I won't even try to pay attention, because it's, as a dad, you probably know this. You sit down for 5 minutes and you fall asleep because there's no way you can chase a 2-year-old. Your brain just doesn't move that fast anymore. So I wrestled a little bit with some of the things that you were talking about, maybe a little bit because from a fundamental standpoint, where I'm challenged a little bit by maybe the role of story or the weight that we give story inside of culture. And part of this comes a little bit from a conversation that John and Maria had, where they were referring to a blog post from the American Conservative that Rod Dreher had written. And Rod Dreher's been diving in deep to Ian McAllister. And he just kind of goes through a lot of essays and a new book that is out. But he has this key line that he talked about. And I would just want to read it here and then have you kind of comment on it. He says, if you had set out to destroy the happiness and stability of a people, it would have been hard to improve on our current formula. And he says, this is the formula. Remove yourself as far as possible from the natural world. Repudiate continuity of our culture. Believe you are wise enough to do whatever you happen to want and not only get away with it, but have a right to it. And a right to silence those who disagree. Minimize the role played by a common body of belief. Actively attack and dismantle every social structure as a potential source of oppression and reject the idea of a transcendent set of values. And there's a little bit of this that I think maybe is kind of like dad-splaining. I don't know if you've ever dad-splained something to your kids or to your wife, but it's like, hey, this is how this works. And it's true because I see it through my dad eyes. And so when I look at story, I feel like I get the sense that, like McAllister's talking about, when we want to destroy happiness and stability of a culture, that a lot of that tends to be done because you need to recapture an imagination. You present a world or develop an idea of a world where you remove yourself as far as possible from what's natural. So you need to set that up. And then you challenge cultural norms and you set actual norms up as things that are attacking and oppressing people. And you have these transcendent set of values that you can kind of craft and create in another world. And as a dad, to kind of dad-splain it, I'm like, well, wait a minute, this is not actually real, right? Like the transgender movement, like it just doesn't work for society. Let me dad-splain that to you. It just, 1 and 1 doesn't make 2 inside of that world. It doesn't actually work. You can't actually feed your kids in that world. I get this sense of like, sometimes when we look at stories or movies, we have this idea where we have an affinity for story because we feel like Jesus answered a lot of hard questions because he used through the power of story, because he was able to develop a world. And in our world right now, we're seeing story kind of capturing the imagination of our kids and maybe even of ourselves to where it's destroying our world. And we might need to just like put a block on movies and like rebuild the world to say, let me dad-splain this to you. This is how it actually works. So I kind of want to challenge you. You probably weren't ready for this, but I want to challenge you on even the validity of us allowing a story to inform or capture or captivate our attention, our imagination, things like that. Can you give me kind of maybe a defense that way a little bit?
I mean, it's a good observation and sort of suggestion, as radical as it is, if we're talking about modern fare, because I'll be the first to acknowledge that a great deal of what is on offer, even directed at children, as far as entertainment, is subversive, destructive. It tells lies and it attempts to beautify things that are not beautiful with story. And one of the main means by which that happens is some of the scripts that we have come to accept and celebrate, like the script of the oppressed being liberated from their oppressors. It goes all the way back to the Exodus, have been co-opted and filled with new characters and then run on us again. And so the script now is, instead of the slaves being released from bondage in Egypt, the script is, well, now those whose identities have been repressed and whose civil rights have been stolen from them and oppression has been their lot in life, now they're being liberated. And so that script feels familiar, and there's an intuitive sort of impact to it. And when we see that portrayed on screen or in a book or in some other medium, we intuitively say, yes, that's right. That's a hero. That's a victory. That's a right is triumphing over might there. And we've been deceived in that regard because you can't just put anything into those categories. There are certain things that are not true. It's a lie to say that, for instance, one of the sexual identity categories that passes for an oppressed class today is, a valid class of oppression in the first place, or that its claims are even aligned with reality, right? So you can say that you're oppressed all you want because you can't transition to the opposite gender, that it doesn't make it any truer that you can do that. It's like the old Monty Python sketch in Life of Brian, where the guy wants to transition to become a woman so he can have babies. And he's like, don't you oppress me. And the John Cleese character is like, I'm not oppressing you, Stan. You don't have a womb. Where's the fetus going to gestate? You're going to keep it in a box? I think that was John Cleese. I have to go back and review my Monty Python cast. The point of all that is the stories are being used with the familiar scripts are being used to tell lies in a lot of cases. And so that's something we have to insulate ourselves and our children from because it's manipulative. It trains us to think things are true that are not true because they feel true. And that's the whole game with a lot of this stuff. I mean, entertainment is storytelling for the most part, and it's used to inform our moral knowledge. It shapes our consciences. And Kasey and I talked about how one of the real reasons that we watch stuff and find it entertaining is not the fact that there's flashing lights on the wall and the fact that we're getting sensory stimulation. The real draw of it all is that we see fictional characters or maybe real life characters retold in a dramatic setting, facing adversity and overcoming it. And we look at that and we think, I could do that too. If they could do it, then I could do it too. And that teaches us the shape of the universe and gives us gives that fulfillment of having come to a greater understanding. But if we haven't actually come to a greater understanding, if our understanding of the world has been warped by what we watched a gay propaganda piece like Call Me By Your Name, or we watch Cuties or something. I mean, just pulling out the worst titles that I could, think of here that are going to try to pull on your heartstrings to make you think something is true that's not true. That's manipulative. And so, yes, that would be a wise policy to question whether it's even worth it to yourself engage or allow your children to engage in pop entertainment. If you back up a lot, though, and start talking about some of the older stories, then the answer changes. We talk all the time about some of our most beloved old stories here on this podcast. And I would say your moral universe is going to be not only profoundly impoverished, but utterly crippled by depriving yourself and your family of old stories that actually do tell the true shape and contours of the world, not least scripture itself, right? Because it is full of stories and it functions along those lines. And it has fiction and nonfiction. It's historical and parabolic. There's lots in there that's purely for the sake of illustrating. And it's always designed to, elicit this response from us. And it's always designed to shape our consciences and shape our moral imaginations and knowledge in a certain direction. And all the great stories that follow scripture that are merely human in origin, they all sort of follow that example and make those same sorts of moves. And they're essential to what makes us human. So I think we should fight very hard for story, for the concept of story and all the medium by which it comes to us. And that includes really new stuff, like historically speaking, new stuff like film and television. I'm not saying that, you have to be constantly trying to find the redemptive, salvage some redemptive message in this or that artifact of pop culture, because the cold fact is that most of it's pretty disposable and it's not going to stand the test of time, like we said. But at the same time, I get great joy out of watching and engaging mentally and spiritually with stuff that I think is good and actually does build up your moral thinking in a positive direction. And it's a difficult task to sort through what is and what is not good. And I'm not here to give anyone the answers on what to watch, what not to watch. I would say probably don't watch Cuties, okay? I would say there's some definitely obvious cases where, unless you're writing about things for cultural criticism purposes, probably not best to poison your mind and eyeballs with that sort of thing. But there is much still that is worth engaging with and perhaps even worth celebrating. And Kasey and I talked about a few of those. The point of the conversation was not so much to say, here's the good, here's the bad, and here's the difference. It was to help illustrate, and Kasey shares this conviction, that even modern movies that we would classify as popcorn flicks, even the TV shows, the stuff that seems like throwaway, is ultimately still scratching an itch that we have that's much deeper than the itch to be stimulated in our senses. It is an itch to care about characters, to follow their stories, to watch them overcome adversity, and to learn something from it. And we may say to ourselves, I'm not learning anything. I'm not getting any life lessons from this. I'm not watching, Law and Order Special Victims Unit to learn about the world. But you are learning about the world, whether it's the true world or not. And that's part of the pleasure of it. And that's also part of the peril of it. And the task of the Christian is to be aware of that fact instead of just being like a passive recipient of it.
Right. So that leads me to my next question. I'm glad you kind of framed a little bit of what you were talking about, because I too share your affinity for Dr. Glenn Sunshine. His book, Why You Think the Way You Do, was just really powerful for both my wife and I, kind of in just our understanding of the world and how we think and why we think, and processing the influence of Christian thought throughout all of history and civilization. And you kind of referenced Thor as a movie that kind of skirts, or actually probably more trashes, the traditional Norse mythology and actually adopts a lot of Judeo-Christian ideals inside of it. And I wrestled a little bit, though, with this kind of thing as you guys were talking about. So maybe you can help me see this, because I think a lot of times when we read even things inside of Scripture, we'll read it and we'll want to project ourselves onto like David, or we'll want to project ourselves onto Joshua, or even maybe like project ourselves onto like the sower and the seed. And we kind of imagine ourselves in these different places or whatever. We put ourselves in these stories. And I think that inside of Scripture and in interpreting Scripture, that can be really problematic. So can you speak to that? How is it dangerous for us when we read inside of Scripture to project ourselves into the story? And then when we watch a movie, is that something that we should also be doing? Or is this a little bit more like we're watching the fishbowl and identifying and understanding what's actually happening in the fishbowl, the ecosystem, all of that, and just coming away with maybe kind of a lighter understanding of, oh, this was the moral of that story, but it might not necessarily apply to my life. Help me walk through that. What is actually the role then? I guess my overarching story, to use kind of those two things, is what is the role of story in our life if it's not to project ourselves into the story? And it's also not to just to take kind of like this light and fluffy idea of Memento, or, one of those films where you're like, that will never happen to me. And that's a really interesting thought. And now I'm going to go and have a burrito or whatever. Like, you just kind of, it's this light, fluffy thing that just kind of trails behind you that was really interesting to think about, but I don't know what the message is that I'm supposed to take from that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. When we talk about stories shaping us, I guess there's this temptation to think and to deceive ourselves. We're kind of conceited about this, to think that we have a lot of our moral categories and proclivities and thoughts just built into us from birth, right? That we come prepackaged as people who love mercy, who root for underdogs, who care for the oppressed and want to see them released from their oppressors, who want to see right triumph over might, and so forth. And I think there is an element of intrinsic conscience, right? That the beginning chapters of Romans talks about. We have the knowledge of God's law written on our hearts, that we transgress it knowingly. We are without excuse, and so forth. So that is true. Lewis talks about the Tao, or this non-negotiable, unquestionable, universal principle of right conduct that everyone has access to. At the same time, I think we have to be careful not to underestimate the role that stories and imitation play in shaping our moral instincts and potentially reshaping them. So your latent potential as a moral being and your conscience, which tells you what's right and wrong, can be seared, molded, and I think transformed into a malformed conscience by imitation. And pretty soon you're transformed into this creature that, St. Paul would not recognize as morally informed. You become very morally ignorant. the world, or of the world of norms that God instituted when he created human beings. And so you end up with a history full of cultures whose moral norms we would not recognize. And this is the other side of the equation. This is Rodney Stark. This is Tom Holland. This is where you begin to recognize that, okay, those Vikings that we love to celebrate in modern pop culture, we've got countless movies and TV shows that sort of take up the Viking aesthetic and use that as a setting and even play at portraying something like history. Well, most of them are not. Most of them, as Glenn pointed out, are really just giving you a Christianized or westernized version of Vikings and their morality. The morality of those people, actual pagan, medieval Europe, we would not have recognized their pre-Christian way of doing things. I guess that would be, early medieval. That'd be like at the end of the Roman period, before Christianity even began to percolate up into the Scandinavian countries. And we would look at these people, even a secular person, even a Richard Dawkins, even a Sam Harris, even a Bill Maher, who just loves to sort of mock faith, would look at Viking morality or Greco-Roman morality or Hindu morality. And they would say, yikes, both the Vikings and the Hindus, we have records of them, burning widows on their husbands' funeral pyres. That's a practice that is just very common in the ancient world. Child sacrifice, very common. This sort of attitude that the poor and the weaker don't matter. They're just there to be exploited. Tom Holland puts it really frankly. He says that the Greco-Roman attitude toward women and children was that they existed to be penetrated by powerful men and that they were there to satisfy the sexual cravings of those men. And that was just how the world was set up, right? So, but those customs and those beliefs and those moralities were the result of, they're perpetuated through imitation. They're perpetuated, as I understand it, through, just kids growing up and being enculturated into that society. And if it could be proven, which might be an interesting experiment, that people have a natural revulsion to seeing someone victimized like that natural revulsion, we need no further proof than history that natural revulsion can be thoroughly beaten out of them just through seeing the example again and again, to where you come to believe as a young Roman boy or as a young Viking boy that this is just how the world works and this is right. And you're actually cowardly and womanish. The word that I picked up from one author is arger. The Vikings would call anyone who showed unmanly qualities arger. And to show mercy to your enemies, to love and forgive them even, would be seen as profoundly unmanly. And yet, within the course of a few centuries, that whole moral structure is turned on its head. And so people now value love and mercy. Well, what happened? Well, Christianity happened, but that was passed on through imitation and really storytelling in your life, in church, and in child rearing. And that's how people are morally informed. So your question is very broad.
Yeah, on purpose.
yeah. But I think that this is an inherent part of what it means to be human. It's not something that we can back away from or stop doing. It's not a negotiable. It is simply how we work. And we will be informed in one direction or another by our interactions with other people, by growing up, by watching our parents, by hearing the kinds of stories they tell, by watching what's morally approved of and praised in our society. And our intrinsic knowledge of right and wrong will be shaped in that direction. And so we will either affirm the truth or suppress it, as Paul says. And that happens through the power of storytelling and the moral information that comes with that.
So that leads me to this next thought, and that is, within a lot of the ways that I think even inside of this cultural moment, we're in the fall, we can see it, we can look all around us. If we look on a timeline and this cultural moment's represented by a dot, I feel like that dot has just been pulled down and we're inside of a cultural moment. I think that there are ways that stories inspire us and cause us to think through an imaginary, or not imaginary, but really a creative or an imaginative way of how redemption comes about. But there are some ways that I sense that inside of story, we get captured or captivated to understand the problem differently. So an example would be like watching Ocean's 11, Ocean's 12, that was my favorite movie growing up in high school, right? I just thought, this is amazing. And then there was one day where my dad's like, you know that they're stealing, right? And I was like, yeah, but they're doing it for a good reason, Dad. Like they're redeeming the world, Dad. And then I thought, man, my concept of redemption and even what restoration looks like has been captivated.
Now you see it is like that as well, right? It's a heist movie, but with magicians.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so I wonder inside of this, and even like in Star Wars or these other movies, we have a sense of what redemption and restoration are, but they can never bring you fully back up. If you use that timeline analogy, they can never bring the dot fully back up to the original timeline. And I would say even to an upper level or like a fourth dimension where we're really understanding the world from God's story. Even I get this impression even inside of like, movies that are beautiful, like The Chosen, that really do a great job depicting or describing the role of Christ in the world, that sometimes even our understanding of what redemption looks like, even for Jesus in that time period, we don't really fully see it because we just see, oh yeah, that person's bleeding. And so Jesus comes over and he heals them. And isn't that great? That's our calling in redemption. And really no, there's a whole nother level that I think we need to be pulled up into, that we understand when we understand the whole canon of what's going on. And so I wrestle a little bit with this, with actual stories and movies right now, because I almost feel, and this maybe just be my dad splaining and maybe my dad defense of like, why I couldn't participate in a discussion on, Narnia, or why I couldn't participate in a discussion on Star Wars or even like the new Top Gun movie. Because I'm like, I don't know if I want to put myself into a place where I just get this sense of, man, my imagination has been captivated to a false idea of what redemption looks like in that moment. So can you maybe inspire me a little bit to don't take it so seriously or process it differently as a dad? Or is that like, hey, that's an okay thing to be at? What do you say to that as a friend, as I'm wrestling through even that desire to sit down and watch a movie with popcorn versus doing something else for leisure in this time?
Well, I would say if you don't like modern entertainment, then you shouldn't spend much time on it.
I probably like it almost too much. That's my problem. Yeah. I'm kind of like,
oh, I see. Okay. So you are drawn in that direction.
So I'm nervous that I'm going to get caught in it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good fear to have, not least because most of this stuff, whether it has a redemptive and laudable message or not, it's going to be easy to become a waste of time. Right. So it has a certain addictive quality to it. This is a very passive activity. You're sitting, you're watching, you're being entertained, you're being thrilled. There is some sensory sort of stimulation on a raw animal level that's taking place in the same way that, babies will watch a screen. I don't think it's because babies are deeply captivated in the story and like thinking in terms of being the characters and the moral choices they have to make and the adversity they have to overcome and da-da-da-da-da. I think primarily babies are just stimulated by the flashing and the noises. And that's why their toys pretty much do the same thing. So that's working on some level with you, causing you to be addicted and drawing you into the spiral of consumption there. And you should be cautious on that level, but you should also be cautious on the level of, the use of your time and resources, your mental energy. Those are all legitimate, prudent questions to ask. How am I allocating my time? Is this too appealing to me? Are there better things I could be doing with my time as opposed to this? Am I neglecting any scriptural duties, any Christian callings and vocations where I'm supposed to be doing better and I'm instead spending it on Netflix? Those are legitimate questions to ask. And then, if you feel that you're the kind of person who could be appealed to on a deep level by messages that are misleading, that are going to malform your instincts as a moral thinker and a man or a woman, parent, a father, even a pastor, then you should be really wary of that as well. I think a lot of modern entertainment, and we all have our weaknesses, right? But a lot of modern entertainment will portray, especially things like rom-coms, will kind of paint this picture of the good life that involves, maximal freedom, lots of travel, lots of enjoying of expensive meals, exotic experiences, destinations, and the ability to just sort of throw money casually around to satisfy your appetites. And we look at that and we think, golly, that would be fun. There's something that's really appealing about that. And it's because, well, on one level, those are good things. There are a lot of intrinsic goods being celebrated. Obviously, promiscuity is not intrinsically good, and wasting money is not intrinsically good, but traveling is nice. Good food is nice. When I see someone going to a tropical destination and like scuba diving on a coral reef, that's very appealing to me. I've never done that outside of the United States. But the point is, your loves can become disordered through that. So if any of those things are true, and I haven't even mentioned, I guess I did mention briefly, but I haven't even talked about stuff that's genuinely evil, that's actually going to teach you to love wrong. That's the kind of stuff, that can really be classified as just, you shouldn't even come anywhere near that as a Christian. But even entertainment that's not overtly wicked can nonetheless malform you. And so all those cautions are valid. I would say, on the other hand, though, as a reason to continue engaging, the reason that I continue to consume thoughtfully what I think of as good and powerful movies and television, and occasionally things like, I'm not a super culturally well-fed guy, so I don't go to live performances of things other than like Max McLean,
which is probably the best live performance that I've seen in a long time. Yeah,
and I watched the movie version of Hamilton that was on Disney Plus. So, occasionally, the Gerard Butler Phantom of the Opera. Okay. That's the extent of my, my cultural experience there. But there are all these media with which you can engage, I think, quite fruitfully and pleasurably. And it doesn't have to be a negative in your life. In fact, because humans are made in the image of God, the stuff that comes out of even secular studios and production companies that's not explicitly Christian, or that's not crafted by someone who thinks in a Christian way about the world, which, by the way, there are a lot of those people in there quietly doing, their work as Christians without being overt about it. Even then, the fact that humans are made in the image of God, the fact that our loves and our emotions and our moral understanding are designed to seek God and to seek the good, that means that there will inevitably be a great deal of good in there, and beauty and truth. It's not wrong to enjoy those things as part of your relaxation, or even, as we talked about, recently on Upstream, your leisure time. And that's what I try to do. Am I perfect at it? Not by a long shot. I have watched Seinfeld, same as many, many people out there, since the 90s. And I could sit here all day and try to come up with any sort of redeeming feature of Seinfeld. And honestly, I don't think I could, because it quite literally is a show about nothing. And it's just that you're laughing about the ridiculousness of these scenarios they've come up with. And that's all there is. And do I think it's wrong? No. Do I think it's something you should spend a great deal of time on? Absolutely not. So those are the considerations you have to take into account. It's very not black and white in my thinking. It's very sort of shades of gray. And it has to do with being a discerning person, the kind of person who has wisdom, has experience, and can look at the buffet of entertainment laid out before us and say, I will have some of this and some of that and a little bit of that, but I'm not going to sit here and overindulge. So if you're in front of a buffet, it'd be real easy to take, like, what's the most ridiculous dessert you can imagine? Marshmallow casserole or something like that, right? And just like shovel a bunch of that onto your plate and then just binge eat marshmallow casserole. And that's a thing you could do. And no, I cannot point to a precise number of spoonfuls of marshmallow casserole where it becomes no longer adiaphora, it becomes sin, right? To eat that much. I can't. And I don't think I should have to. It's a question of wisdom. How much is too much? And are there things on there that you shouldn't have at all? Again, wisdom. And I think a lot of that same thinking applies to the world of entertainment. So yes, you're right to be cautious. I might try to persuade you to see certain things that I think are really good and can inspire you and uplift you, but I wouldn't be in the stands saying, Wayne, you gotta watch more TV. You gotta watch. No, go be with your kids. Go be a good dad. Go read them some books.
Yeah, there are parts of culture that you just are outside of if you haven't watched, Star Wars, or you haven't participated in watched or seen The Greatest Showman or something like that. Like I don't know if The Greatest Showman's a great example, but that's just one in our family that we're like, yeah.
That's high theater, brother.
Yeah, right. I would love to see that in live theater, and that would be amazing. But I think that there's parts of even inside of cinema, and as you're talking through this kind of crafting and building a world that have a lot of value. And so I'd like to, as we kind of close out here, have you explain that for me. How do you sense or believe that things like movie, cinema, different presentations of the world, where they can actually kind of build a world, even inside of literature, we have this. But what is the role of that even inside of the believer? Because I think a lot of times as believers, we get the first 2 chapters of the story really well, right? We get the creation. We can understand how God created the world. We can even understand like his role inside of history from a creation standpoint, that God is in control. We can understand the fall. But when it comes to redemption and restoration, I think sometimes we don't have that sense of even like an imagination of what that looks like. But I do believe that inside of some of this cinema and movies, that can kind of happen. So help me understand how you have sensed that participating or being a part of or watching or viewing movies, cinema, live drama, maybe even like books, where that will change or shape even your understanding of how to approach what redemption and restoration look like for a believer.
There's this great section in Jordan Peterson's 12 More Rules for Life. Actually, it's called Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. And he talks about stories and characterizations and how humans have, since the dawn of our history, have learned from stories and characters. And that's how we've learned our moral values and our understanding of the world, right? Our worldviews are shaped by stories. He says that in these things we have I'm not quoting, I'm just sort of paraphrasing here, but in these things we find the courage to go on when it seems impossible. And that's why we love stories about that sort of scenario the most. The reason why men are so drawn to a movie like Gladiator, right? It's not because it comes out and states in a sort of didactic way that even when everything is taken from you, pursuing justice, and in this case, it's like justice he seizes for himself. It's like vengeance. That pursuing justice and remembering the ones that you loved and staying the person that you have determined to be in your, highest moral understanding, which in his case was Stoicism, because Marcus Aurelius is caught up in this whole thing, is a good, and it's powerful, and it is right to do that. And that makes Maximus the hero of the story. And that's the reason that men watch it, because he overcomes everything and even lays down his life in the end just for that cause. And that appeals deeply to something inside of us. Peterson says that's very much how we learn, and we thrill to learn because we have more information at the end, even in an implicit way, about how the world works than we had at the beginning. And we don't find that from statements, pure propositional statements of moral truths. You would never come away from Castaway, right, which Kasey and I talked about as a favorite of mine, the same way. If all that happened was Tom Hanks walked on screen in front of a white background and said, "Hey guys, I know sometimes life hands you difficult circumstances, right? You can be in a really bad situation all alone by yourself, but you just got to keep on keeping on, and life is better than death. So choose to continue living another day because you never know what's going to happen," right? That doesn't have pretty much any impact at all. But when you see him torn from the modern world, crashed in the ocean, washed up on an island for 3 years, I think it is, having to endure the depths of human despair, come to the point where he is at the edge of himself. He's like an animal. He doesn't know if he'll ever see another human face again or ever hear another human voice again. And he's actually talking to this volleyball at this, at this point, because he's in such despair. And then he tries to kill himself, but he doesn't succeed for whatever reason. And he comes to a realization, I'm going to keep on living because life is better than death. And as he says, you never know what the tide will bring, because that one day the tide brought him a sail and a chance to get out of there. And I called it an anti-suicide movie, even though it never explicitly says that, because that's exactly what's happening in the story. And you're deeply moved because you've sat there for an hour and 45 minutes or however long and walked with Tom Hanks through that journey and seen what he endured, almost as if you did yourself, so that you feel the full impact when he's sitting with his friend with the glass of water that has ice in it in his house afterwards, being like, I didn't know any of this was going to happen to me, but I'm going to keep going because life is better. It's not even a Christian message, but the message hits you like a ton of bricks, and it has extreme power to encourage a pro-life attitude toward your own experiences, because you've seen it in a story. And that's true with everything. I mean, every story that inspires and moves people works the same way. And they come away instructed on an ineffable subconscious level where they don't even know. Like, if you were to ask people walking out of that movie or another movie that had a powerful moral message, what was the message of that movie? You're going to get a lot of different answers. And a lot of them may cluster around the truth. They may say different things about what the point was. But I think that the deepest work happens on a level that's low, that's further down than speech, that's upstream of speech, you might even say. It happens in our consciences, in our hearts, in our emotions, in our imaginations, most of all. And that's why, they have such power. That's why secular stories, I say secular, in a sort of crass way. I don't think there is such a thing as secular ultimately, but that's why stories that are not explicitly Christian can be and are often some of the best. I don't think they have to be explicitly Christian in order to speak the truth beautifully and to instruct us in goodness. They're powerful though, which is why we have to be careful with them, because they can also malform us and train our emotions to think that things are true that are not true, to think that things are beautiful that are not beautiful. And that's why I'm so fascinated with stories, even the really cheap sort of pop culture stuff, because they are an immensely powerful tool that gets right down to the heart of what it means to be human. And we should be concerned with them as Christians, interested in them, and I think engaged with them. And I would love to talk to someone on Upstream who is actually succeeding in that regard. I have in the past, right? I talked with Jonathan Rumi, who plays Jesus in The Chosen. That's just one example. So I have talked to these people. But yeah, I'm very impressed with the power of those things. And that's why I wanted to have that conversation.
Yeah, well, I think it was very valuable and important to have too, especially as we're entering into summer movie season and, Maverick and we just watched the Top Gun movies the other day. And that's a little bit where my thought of like, oh, what does redemption look like? Because this is shaping even my view of what redemption looks like. Is it vengeance? Is it, coming out on top? What does that really look like? And so I think that this is such an important conversation to have.
Well, let me ask you this. Did you like it? Was Top Gun, the new Top Gun, good?
My son has seen it. I'm like the dad that was like, hey, let's watch the first one together. And then you go see this one. And then I want to hear what you think. And then I'm going to go watch it myself. So we have actually, he loved it. He thought it was great. But
I just asked that as an aside because I've gotten virtually unanimous endorsements. I haven't seen it yet, but people saying this is very good. And it seems like the more conservative socially and temperamentally they are, the more likely they are to say they liked it. So I'll be very interested to walk into that one and see now. But thanks so much for having this conversation. This was a lot of fun. And thank you also, Wayne, for all the time that you've spent on the program here in just so many dimensions, making Upstream what it is. If my listeners right now were present with us, I know they'd give you a big round of applause. And so I appreciate your hard work, your thoughtfulness, and your dedication to making this podcast a good one to listen to. And I hope we can find someone who can begin to fill your shoes, or perhaps several someone's. But thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. It's a pleasure and an honor.